We need to know the conditions for these troops to be deployed. And as the Prime Minister has said very clearly, and we support that, these troops can only be deployed if there is a US backstop. And that means that whatever happens, the US is part of the responsibility for the safety and security of these forces.
The UK's Defence Secretary John Healey has called on Vladimir Putin to accept plans for a ceasefire to end the war in Ukraine. It comes as defence ministers from 5 European nations, France, Germany, Italy, Poland and the UK, met in Paris to discuss security. We've also heard from Donald Trump as well late on this afternoon, saying that there could be very bad things on the way for Russia, economic sanctions, in other words, or economic measures, should they not accept that ceasefire deal. Let's speak to Miguel Berger, German ambassador to the UK. Miguel, a warm welcome to you. Thanks for being with us on Times Radio.
Okay, good evening.
Let's talk about the ceasefire deal. Can we trust Putin to keep to it if he does sign up to it, of course?
I mean, Kate, let's first see how the Russians are going to react. And I mean, we all welcomed now this offer that was put on the table. To be honest, I'm very skeptical that Putin will accept it right away. Knowing Russian negotiation tactics, I would not be surprised if he comes back with counter proposals and questions and trying to put the ball back into the Ukrainian field. So we are not yet there.
You're not the first person who said that to me tonight. We've been speaking to the Foreign Minister of Finland, Elina Valtonen, and she feels strongly as well that Vladimir Putin will not just accept it, he'll come back and ask for concessions, ask for more. I wonder what the response could be if Russia start messing around, if they start trying to negotiate. Do you think Donald Trump will draw a hard line at that? What he said in the Oval Office today, he's been speaking to reporters. He said he's had some very positive messages from Russia, but a positive message means nothing. This is a very serious situation. It could start World War III. That's what Donald Trump's had to say. What do you make of that?
I think we should not comment every phrase of President Trump. I think the most important signal was that the US now delivers against military supplies to Ukraine, that they give military intelligence, that they put Ukraine again in a stronger position. But at the same time, I think we should all be firm to reject any additional, conditions or whatever comes from Russia, and especially if these conditions infringe on the future sovereignty of Ukraine. So, for example, the question if Western troops are or are not in Ukraine is not something to negotiate with Russia. That should be a sovereign decision of Ukraine.
So you're saying that if Russia start making demands, we shouldn't accept those. But then we're back to square one. Still no peace in Ukraine. And as Donald Trump is very fond of pointing out, still more lives lost. And so what is the situation then, do you think, if Russia do start making demands? Do we just cut them dead? Do we just say that's it, ceasefire deal, temporary ceasefire deal's off? How does the US respond to that? We need to be sort of light of foot here, don't we?
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously very, very important that the US stands firm on the side of Ukraine. There will be negotiations and there are very many important things. And President Zelensky mentioned prisoner exchanges, the children which were abducted, the question of accountability, the question of the destruction.
But those things are never going to be achieved during a 30-day ceasefire deal, are they?
Absolutely not.
Even if it rolls over.
Yeah, no, you are right, Kate. But the important thing is that this 30-day ceasefire, which can be expanded further, is used in order to set up the framework for future negotiations. And I think that is the way these 30 days should be used, because at some point we have to enter into serious negotiations. And there, the key question, I think, for all of us in Europe, the British government, the European governments, is that Russia cannot make claims which affect the sovereignty of Ukraine. And to maintain this sovereignty, will be our red line, and absolutely important that Europe sits at the table and is included into these negotiations, because in the end, as we know, this will determine, the outcome will determine Europe's security situation in the future.
Yeah. Look, we've been speaking to the Finnish foreign minister, as we've said. She says Finland are part of the coalition of the willing. Is Germany part of it too?
Germany has been, from day one, part of the planning process. We have been with our defense minister, with the chief of defense staff the last 2 days in Paris. The final decision, if we deploy troops in the German case, has to be taken by our parliament. So we need the new parliament, but we need more than that. We need to know the conditions for these troops to be deployed. And as the Prime Minister has said very clearly, and we support that, these troops can only be deployed if there is a US backstop. And that means that whatever happens, the US is part of the responsibility for the safety and security of these forces.
So if there's no US backstop, to be very clear, if there's no US backstop, and we could be talking about temporary peacekeepers as part of this ceasefire deal. JD Vance was asked about that today, and he was again open to the idea of that happening. We know Russia are very opposed to it. But essentially, from your perspective, from Germany's perspective, if there's no backstop, if there's no security guarantee cover from the US, there will be no European troops, or certainly not German troops, on the ground in Ukraine.
I don't think that it would be feasible to have boots on the ground if there is no US backstop. And that's why President Macron and the Prime Minister have made this call to the US to support this reassurance force. But, you know, the question how a ceasefire can be monitored is something completely different, because there we will have to see if this ceasefire is along the 1,300 kilometers of front line. We will need some kind of surveillance to make sure that the ceasefire deal is respected. But I would totally separate the discussion on the surveillance from the discussion of a coalition and a reassurance force, which needs a much more detailed planning.
Yeah. Poland's President Duda has submitted a request for NATO to increase its minimum guideline for defence spending to 3% of GDP, up from 2%. Is that a good idea? Is that something Germany is seriously looking at? You're now at 2.1% of GDP. You've recently increased that, haven't you, to be able to get to that point? You're only just at 2%. How would Germany feel about 3%?
You know, definitely we are going to increase defense spending, and we are currently debating in Germany between the main parties how to lift our debt brake in order to allow additional funding of our defense budget. But I personally think it's not helpful, you know, to play with numbers. The important thing are the NATO capabilities. What does NATO need in order to defend Europe? And depending on these capabilities, we will then in the end come up with a number at the NATO summit in June. But the European Union has just announced up to 800 billion of additional funding for defense. Rearm Europe will be the program for the next years to come. So a lot will take place in the coming years on industrial capacity, on defense spending, on strengthening our armies and our interoperability in Europe.
Yeah. Look, Keir Starmer, our Prime Minister, has received a lot of plaudits here for his dealings with Donald Trump so far. Can I ask what you make of Keir Starmer, the Trump whisperer?
I must say that we are very, very satisfied, and we applaud also the Prime Minister for the way he not only handled the visit to Washington, but also the personal relationship he has established with the American president, the London conference, the cooperation with France and with other partners, because in the end, the big countries in Europe United Kingdom, France, Poland, Germany, Italy, and others, we all have to work together in order to engage the US and have a strong NATO and have US and to maintain the US as strongly as possible in NATO also in the future.
Let's just talk about tariffs briefly, because we've heard the EU response today to those US tariffs. They're going to implement the EU tariffs on a retaliatory basis on everything from Harley Davidsons to lingerie. Do you think Germany will sign up to the EU proposal for retaliatory tariffs?
You know, Kate, that's a little bit a déjà vu, because we had the same discussion under Trump 1. They put the tariffs on steel and aluminium. We put the counter tariffs, and 3 months later, we had a negotiation in order to lift this. I think it was the right reaction. It is the right reaction. It was applauded also in Germany. And we need to make clear to the US that these tariffs and the uncertainty which is created in the international markets for business, for investors, is detrimental to everybody. We need growth in Europe. We need to invest in defense, and we can't be bogged down between allies in trade wars. This is our, I would say, very measured reaction from the side of the European Union. Yeah. We really hope that the US will be willing to engage in order to be able to lift tariffs.
Yeah, let's see. There are a very broad range of tariffs, and Donald Trump has not been complimentary about the EU when it comes to tariffs. There's a trade deficit there as well, which is different to what we have in the UK. Look, really good to speak to you. Thank you for being with us. Miguel Berger, who is German ambassador to the UK. Take care and good evening. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening.